you'll recall that Jonathan Choe tried to ask questions about public safety at a press conference with King County Executive Dow Constantine, and Dow Constantine ended up fleeing and trying to go down an elevator to avoid answering questions. And it's the executive's office's contention that Jonathan Choe is not a journalist because he's a fellow for the Discovery Institute, which has a political bend. But Jonathan Choe has been doing great independent journalism on homelessness, and he's been a journalist in Seattle for several years. And so I happen to think it's all just bullshit. But here's a little clip of what happened a few weeks ago.
So why not put a moratorium on this before public input?
You're not actually a journalist. You were fired for promoting the Proud Boys. So we talk with reporters like those in the room, and we're not.
So you're not talking to me anymore and accuse me of promoting the Proud Boys. You're an elected official.
And things have only ramped up since then. So on Monday, there was a press tour of this homelessness complex shelter in SoDo, the south of downtown Seattle. And it was invite only or RSVP for the media, but Jonathan Choe has been cut off from the executive's office, deemed not media, so he just showed up, and this is what ensued.
On the invite list 24 hours.
It's open to members of the media.
I've contacted you multiple times, Marta. You haven't returned any of my calls.
Katie Rogers with King County, and you haven't given her 24 hours notice. So we're
You
going to
don't need to make a scene about that.
So are you gonna? You haven't even sent me an email.
You're not a member of the media, Jonathan.
I'm not a member of the media, so I'm
Absolutely
not
correct.
being allowed to go into this tour.
Into the media tour? No, you're not.
Okay. What is it going to take for me to be able to go into this media tour?
You would have to work for a media organization, which you do not. You work for an advocacy group,
I work for Discovery
which
Institute.
is an advocacy group.
Well, we have a media wing called FixHomelessness.org.
Not a media wing.
Okay.
These are broadcast journalists, independent journalists. They work for media groups, not. Jonathan, you are not allowed in there.
I'm going to go as I don't understand why I'm not being allowed to go
You're
in.
not a member of the media, Jonathan.
So I'm not being allowed to go in?
No.
Okay.
So I hopped on a Facebook Live on Monday and shared my just deep disappointment, my disgust with how he was treated. And I also don't understand to what end this is happening. I mean, what's the worst thing that happens if you let him in and he does a story on it? You don't like the outcome of the story? I just don't understand from a PR perspective what the executive's office thinks it's accomplishing here. But I also think it's incredibly dangerous to journalism. What would happen if some Republican politician wanted to keep out the Seattle's alt weekly newspaper, The Stranger, because they, disagree with them politically? And so not only am I disappointed deeply in the executive's office, but also with any members of the media who are staying silent on this. I've received a few private messages from members of the press who are also concerned, but they won't say anything publicly. And I have stopped responding because I'm sorry, at some point you have to speak out. I don't want anybody to lose their job or to be put in a difficult position, but the mainstream outlets need to be saying something. But anyway, I had Jonathan Choe join us. I wanted Jonathan Choe to join us today for Fridays with Friends to talk a little bit about what happened and I guess what his strategy is moving forward, because I can tell you one thing, he is not going to give up. Jonathan Choe, welcome back to Fridays with Friends. I wish it was for better reasons.
Yeah, I'm always here if there's a controversy, Brandi, so I'm used to this. Part of the course, so.
I know, I feel bad. Fridays with Friends is supposed to be fun, and then I'm always dragging people down. But you seem to be kind of taking this in stride. What were your expectations, I guess, when you went down there, knowing, how your previous encounter with his office had gone, knowing that they'd kind of cut off communication with you? So what did you expect, I guess, when you showed up?
Well, since I'm part of the media and I'm a journalist, it was a press conference, and it was a tour of Dow Constantine's proposed homeless megaplex that's officially in SoDo, but a block away from the Chinatown ID. As this was happening, hundreds of senior citizens from Chinatown were marching towards this megaplex, and there was a group of journalists ready to go in. And because I was allowed into the last press conferences, the last two prior to this, I thought it wouldn't be a problem. But as you know, according to the video, that's when this encounter ensued.
And, I've been in touch with Dow's office, and they did say in this instance it had to be RSVP because of limited space in the actual area where people are living. But your contention is that even if you're not getting the press releases, right?
Yeah, and that's the piece that Chase Gallagher, Dow Constantine's media handler, failed to mention. And I'm not getting these emails anymore from them intentionally. They've cut me off. When I worked at Como, I was getting all of these press releases to come cover this event, that event. But now I don't get these anymore. So I wasn't even given an opportunity to RSVP. And that's why I showed up, thinking, again, because they let me in the other press conferences up to this point, I wouldn't have any problems.
Yeah, and so it's disingenuous for them to say, oh, well, you had to RSVP 24 hours ago when they are clearly blocking your ability to RSVP. And I don't think the outcome would have been different had you somehow gotten that email and RSVP'd. I think they would have told you, we declined to participate in your project, as they've been telling you over and over. One other thing I want you to respond to in my conversations with the executive's office is they're taking issue with your sort of demeanor at some of these events. This is a place where people are living. They said there's an expectation of privacy, which to me suggested that they thought that you'd go into these bays where people are living and sleeping and kind of plaster their faces all over the place. So do you want to respond to the characterization that you are not on your best behavior at some of these events?
Well, first of all, thank you for bringing that to my attention. This is the first time I'm hearing anything of this. Dow Constantine, his handlers, they've never, ever communicated any concerns they've had with me. Look, at the end of the day, I believe in common sense, decency, respect, and maintaining some form of decorum. And up to this point, it's been that way at the press conferences. I have absolutely zero idea where they're getting any sense that I would go and disrupt anyone's place of living, where they're sleeping. If they told me straight up, don't shoot video in this part of the shelter, I wouldn't do it. If they told me don't show this person's face, of course I wouldn't do it. I'm there as a guest, so I would never do anything that would cross any boundaries or rules if they had clearly laid that out. But once again, I was never given that opportunity to even go in and show this common decency.
Yeah, and one of the things I pointed out to them at the first press conference where, we had this conversation because Dow ran away from you and tried to go down an elevator. And let me just play this clip quick.
Executive Constantine, I have a couple of questions related to public safety. So basically,
Sorry, we'll take any other questions offline. Thank you very much.
Follow up with you.
So what people will notice is when you start to ask a question of Dow, you're very calm and professional. You ask a question, you want to ask a question about public safety, and it's not until they make it clear that they're not taking your questions that you sort of, you pursue him into the hallway. And something I said on the podcast the other day is, how would any reporter respond or journalist respond if they're being treated or met by that level of, pushback?
Yeah, despite the narrative, look, as you've interacted with me as well, Brandi, we've been out in the field together as well. I always try to respect officials, people who are in power, and especially if I'm, on their property or operating on their terms. Again, it's when they refuse to answer my questions or walk away, I feel like I have a right to, at the very least, ask and make sure that they heard my question. So again, a public official like Dow Constantine in a public place, again, according to my basic journalism one-on-one standards that I've always followed, they're fair game. I would never go after Dow Constantine if he's hanging out with his family or at his home. That's just not my style. But if he's in a public place, he's a public elected official on a government property, that's open to the public. Again, I have every right to be there. He has every right to be there as well. And if he wants to answer my questions, great. If he doesn't, fine. So be it. But again, I plan on asking questions like this all the time in those contexts.
One more thing specific to this incident, and then I have a few more broad questions for you. When you were trying to then, record outside the gate looking in, there was an individual with an umbrella who was using it to block your view. I have not been able to ascertain who that person is, but it does not sound like it was an official with the executive's office, correct?
Yeah, look, it's hard to say. When I was out there, they had clearly at that point blocked me from going inside. So I stayed outside of the gated area. That's an area that's run by the Salvation Army shelter, and the Salvation Army's handlers and staff were also there, including their security. So it could have been anybody, but at the time, I was just kind of thinking out loud. And when I immediately saw that umbrella pop out from behind the fence. I was on the other side of the fence, according to the video, and I was just trying to record through the holes in the fence. An umbrella goes up, and immediately I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is what Antifa did to me when I was covering the Black Lives Matter, protests a couple of years ago, and when Antifa hijacked that movement. And I just couldn't believe what was happening. And again, at the moment, I was like, I cannot believe this. I'm at this event being held by Dow Constantine's people, and I'm being blocked by somebody, some staff member on site. So I have yet to determine who that person was, but it wasn't just once, but multiple times, the umbrella coming out, trying to block my camera from simply recording.
Well, and that's what's important to note is this isn't just anybody, because they were inside a perimeter that was clearly being controlled for this particular event. So whether they're with the Salvation Army or a volunteer or something, they were someone who was actively allowed to be inside. What is your plan? I mean, are you going to continue to show up for Dow Constantine press events and push the issue, see what happens? What?
Yeah, short answer is yes, absolutely, especially if it's a press conference, if it's in a public place, if it's in a government building, absolutely, I'm going to show up. And of course, I'm working back channels right now. I'm going to be emailing the executive's office and saying, what can we do to work this out? This is absolutely nuts, okay? Bottom line, I'm a journalist. I don't think Dow Constantine or his handlers get to determine who's a journalist, who's not, who gets to cover a particular story or tell it a certain way or not. I've been an objective journalist for more than 20 years of my career. I've now gone down this road where essentially I'm being backed by a think tank, but we have a media arm, and I've been covering all the stories fairly accurately and objectively up to this point. Bottom line, if you don't like my work, then just say it. But don't say I'm not a journalist. That's just not fair. So I'm at this point right now, and this is the positive news. And to all of this, several news outlets have reached out to me to offer me media credentials because they believe the work I'm doing is journalism. They still believe I'm a journalist. So I'm considering all of my options right now. But best case scenario, Brandi, is that the executive's office understands, hey, I'm a journalist. This is water under the bridge. This is nothing personal. Let's just get back to business. Bottom line, let's get this important information out to the community, out to the public. Because at the end of the day, when I can't ask these questions, there's no assurances other reporters who are let in will ask the same questions I wanted to ask that essentially are an extension of the community, especially the Chinatown ID community that is protesting against this megaplex. But if I can't get in these questions, we can't get out this information. Ultimately, it hurts democracy.
And that's one of the other things I told the executive's office is, have you actually watched what he's put out? Because by any standard, it's journalistic. I mean, very in-depth videos, really interesting content. So I just think, if you apply no bias to it at all, it's journalism by any standard. And without going into too many details, you mentioned that some organizations have offered you press credentials. You and I have had that conversation as well, if it's helpful to get you to continue to go to these events. But I should note, none of those were mainstream outlets, correct? None of those were quote unquote mainstream outlets in Seattle who have stood up for you. Have you heard from any mainstream outlets in Seattle who have come to your defense?
Yeah, without naming any of the mainstream outlets, but I think your viewers and listeners are sophisticated enough to know who the mainstream players are. None of them have reached out whatsoever. It's been radio silence. And it is what it is. It's fine. Our entire industry...
No, it's not fine. It is the furthest thing from fine. So that's very generous of you, but to me it's egregious.
Yeah, I mean, it's disappointing, honestly. It'd be nice to have a stronger fraternity, but clearly after incidents like this, it seems like every man and woman an outlet for themselves. And that's where we have issues right now in local Seattle media. I've said this numerous times now, but the politicians have robust PR teams, and they've clearly now outgunned local media, local Seattle media that's supposed to be there to hold these public officials accountable. And right now, it's just not happening. But I'm going to do my best to continue to at least play my part, Brandi.
Well, and also I just wonder, what's the worst case scenario for them? So you ask a couple hard questions and they have to answer them, and then everybody moves on with their lives. I don't get why they think that they're coming across as the good guy in this. That's what's sort of baffling to me from a public relations standpoint. Two more things. Devil's advocate. Where do you think the line, because it can't be a free-for-all at a press event. Where do you think the line should be drawn between who's allowed to a press event and who's not allowed to a press event?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. That's a question that my team at Discovery Institute we're debating as well. I've also reached out to a lot of my industry colleagues. Look, bottom line, I don't have a quick answer to that right now, and I think it's gonna come down to a case by case basis. But in my instance and in my case, I'm a 20 plus year veteran. I have the pedigree, I have the resume. I've been doing this my entire career. I'm not just some fly by, night operation that just popped up out of nowhere. And the institute I'm with, they've done solid work, including journalism there. So, this is a very interesting time where our entire industry is fragmented. They're trying to redefine its identity as well. So, look, I consider myself a journalist. So I say, look at the work I'm putting out. As you said, is it fair? Is it accurate? Is it objective? And does this person or outlet have a track record in the city? And I do. And I think that should be enough to be allowed in to cover this community and our politicians and the city of Seattle and this region.
Yeah, and I would argue it doesn't even have to be objective. I think yours is, but for instance, The Stranger covers press conferences. They're not objective. I don't have an issue with, I mean, I give my opinion. I think I should be allowed in. So I don't have an issue with that. I think the standard for me should be, are they producing content that people are, journalistic content that people are consuming? And it's not as if you're just showing up and then just to yell questions at them and then you're not putting anything out there.
Yeah, and look, I want everyone in Seattle, especially my followers and public officials, to know I have an audience. I have a pretty big audience now, especially on social media, and the outpouring of support and people saying, "Oh my gosh, I'm getting all the news from you. I'm not watching mainstream local media anymore because they're not covering the stories like the homeless crisis or the crime or everything else that comes with it. I didn't know about the Chinatown story until you started covering it." And that makes me feel like I'm going down the right road and headed in the right direction. I'm just hoping that these politicians, elected officials know I have an audience. People are following my work, and I'm just going to keep on doing what I'm doing, Brandi.
Let's end with this. Are you worried about where this could go? My thought was, when I look at the two instances that we've discussed with Dow Constantine's office, the first one was ridiculous, but the second one was a new level to me. 5 people blocking your entry. And I kept thinking to myself, what would they have done to him if he had tried to kind of push his way in? Are you worried about what their next phase, their next step is going to be to try to keep you out?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I'm bottom line, I'm going to test it, of course, and we'll see. So stay tuned for that. But my concern overall is this chilling effect that I believe it could have on journalism and journalists. Look, I'm going to tell you right now, there are several journalists reached out to me. They wanted to remain off the record and said, Cho, this is why we can't do what you do. We can't ask the tough questions because we don't want to lose access. We don't want Dow Constantine's people or another elected official contacting our bosses, and making a big deal. I mean, you have a lot of journalists who just want to keep their jobs. They just want to do what they're doing. So they don't want to tackle these tough subjects. But again, this is hurting our democracy when we can't get these questions asked or we can't get these answers and we can't hold our public officials accountable. So I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. But again, getting back to this concern about, how we handle this moving forward, my concern is if public officials see this and they realize, hey, Dow Constantine's office can do this to Jonathan Choe, well, we can do it to other journalists we don't like. We're going to do this to other news outlets that we think, don't align with our values or our agenda. So again, the chilling effect angle, let's wait and see what happens. But again, I still feel like there's time to correct course and for other public officials and other agencies to say, hey, look at the person's track record, look at the experience, and look at the work at the end of the day and make that determination after you go through that process.
Yeah, well, those journalists, I understand they want to keep their job, but they stay silent at their own peril. And I have stopped responding to people who send me messages in solidarity privately, but won't say jack shit publicly. And that's my language, not yours, because I think at some point you have to be brave, or why are we doing this job to begin with? So, Jonathan Choe, keep being brave. I don't know what they're going to do next. Are you willing to get arrested if it comes down to it?
Yeah, well, in Seattle, I don't think they would because they don't even arrest the actual criminals. So we'll see what happens. But I don't think I'd push it that far. Again, I want to say for the record, I never tried to trespass on property. If they stopped me right there, I didn't go any further. So, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. If they have to remove me, then they have to remove me. But I hope they don't arrest me.
I'll bail you out, okay?
Thanks, Brandi. I know you will.
Jonathan Choe, where can people watch your work?
Mainly at fixhomelessness.org. That's our website for our stories, but a lot of the engagement and action happens on my Twitter site at Choe Show, ChoeShow.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Brandi.
I'll reiterate also what I said on the Facebook Live on Monday that I did on the subscriber only episode on Wednesday. I do think it's helpful for those of you who are listening and watching. If there's a mainstream outlet in Seattle or Washington State that you consume, be it TV or print, reach out to them. Send an email, make it polite, but make it firm that you think that they ought to be speaking out against this because you think it's a slippery slope. If you feel that way, I think that's very helpful. I mean, mainstream cares about two things, money and ratings. And if they feel like either of those things are at risk, maybe they'll speak out and do something, or maybe they'll speak out because it's the right thing. I mean, that's certainly what I hope. So we'll stay tuned to what happens with Jonathan Choe. As I expressed to him, there's a possibility we could extend some sort of credential or hire him on an independent basis, if it comes down to that, to go in our stead to these press conferences and file something for us. And see if the executive's office would still remove him. And if they do, then we have a serious situation on our hands. I might be coming to you guys to ask for support for legal counsel, but we're all getting ahead of ourselves. But hopefully they can work this out like adults. If you've not become a subscriber to Undivided already, there are two ways you can do that, and it's as little as $5 a month. So if you think that what we're doing is important, if you find value in it, if you appreciate what we're doing to hold elected leaders accountable and to look at things through the lens of common sense, I would appreciate it if you'd become a paid subscriber to the show. That's how we're funded. This is a people-powered podcast, and you can do it for just $5 a month at patreon.com/undivided. That's patreon.com/undivided. Or you can become a contributor on my locals community, brandykruse.locals.com. Undivided is presented by our founding sponsor, 1530 Mortgage. Visit them at 1530mortgage.com.